Thank you very much, and great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jamileh Jemison, who's going to talk about predicting and preparing for pitfalls in decentralized clinical trials. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on her. If I can just get my notes up. She's digital clinical director and at MindMed, physician scientist, and got a long experience with clinical development and been very much focused on cutting edge approaches to yield high data quality, and increasingly focused on novel products from small molecule oncology, microbiome therapies, and clinical research in big data. And at MindMed, Dr. Jemison leads design and integration of digital tools into observational and interventional studies. But thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Sorry for any confusion it may have caused before. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about predicting and preparing for pitfalls in decentralized clinical trials. And I'm going to focus really on the technology. Most of my work in the past couple of years has been in the US, though we actually have run studies in Europe as well, but in the US, and working on clinical trials that were completely sightless. So, the perhaps holy grail of decentralized clinical trials, depending on your perspective. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Just some quick disclosures. I'm an employee and stockholder of MindMed, and MindMed is affiliated with a couple of institutions that are really working on transforming clinical trials, the Critical Path Institute, the Clinical Trials Transformative Initiative, and the Digital Medicine Society. And specifically, I sit on a lot of the committees where we have our engagement. It's been particularly exciting to get to know the EPRO consortium with CPI, the CTTI steering committee, and just kicking off a digital measurement standards initiative with DIME's digital health collaborative community. So perhaps there'll be talks about that particular topic in the future. But I do also make known some resources from CPI and CTTI at the end. So just wanted you to know there's an affiliation there. So I'm sure that everyone at this conference is here because you believe in doing decentralized clinical trials. And I think we know some of the advantages. The technology and the desire to do them has been coming along for a while, but certainly the pandemic disrupted a lot of things and really made it a necessity to have at a minimum some decentralized elements for your study. And then once folks got a taste of that, right, it's desirable to be a patient in a study and maybe to be able to do more of it at home, or to interact more frequently and have more of a sense that you're participating in the research, and often to get data back, which is something that I'll talk about a little bit later. Certainly, if you're within an institution and you're on the innovation side, the necessity of technology and digital clinical trials has also made it possible to really promote technological advancements in your programs. But two things I like to always point out about why decentralized clinical trials are particularly important now are one, if you are co-developing technology to go along with a therapeutic program, or you have a technology that is the core, people are much more open to doing research at home and taking your technology into a real world environment immediately. And so you get really strong feedback there and can have a course through a development program with technology there. And then very critical, as we have learned, we've been so poor at it in the past decades of clinical research, we can increase accessibility, and inclusivity of our studies. As I mentioned, I'm going to focus on technology during this time, and my specialty has been completely sightless, sort of direct to participant studies, where you have to ship the technology, or perhaps it is BYOD or web platform, which I will mention a lot today. And the participant sort of is trained at home, is consented at home, and does all of their input through the sensors that you provide. And then that gets back to you in a secure way, and can go both to the clinician, and then sometimes there's participant output, which I highly recommend, and we'll talk about a little bit more. So obviously planning, I know you plan for everything, right? But I've often found that the biggest thing people do not do is plan early enough, right? So a big pitfall that you can absolutely avoid in dealing with your decentralized clinical trial, particularly with getting the technology in, is starting too late, right? So as soon as somebody says, "Yeah, I think we ought to have a study for this," or let's launch our phase one, start thinking about, hey, could even that earliest proof of concept trial be decentralized somehow? Sure, maybe you need to have a lot of PK draws and they can come to the hospital or a clinic for that, but maybe you can do the rest of it at home. So, start early, and when you start, answer some big questions. Can your endpoints be met using technology? If so, what types of technology do you need? Do not forget that, there's plenty of, you can get blood collection at home, you can get blood glucose at home, and sometimes the comfort of not being in the clinic makes participants more willing to do various tasks that you wouldn't predict. So look for what type of technology is out there, including just the participant's comfort, and use it. Who will be using your technology? This is a critical question. The clinicians, I think, often feel like they may have been a little bit left out. It's overlooked the kind of lead time they might need on adoption to get a new tool into the clinic. If you're going to need different technology for the patients than you do for the clinicians, you want to be on top of that. So that's why you ask these questions early. And then I put observers in there because sometimes you want feedback from someone who's perhaps in the home with a patient. Will they be using the same technology as the patient, or will they be using something different? And also, we found that it's useful to consult your ethics board or regulatory body early in the process. Regardless, just sort of like we plan to use technology here, but also if the technology might be integral to the rest of your development program, perhaps you're hoping you can use some of the data here as an endpoint or as a surrogate endpoint. So you want to make sure that you start having those conversations early. And then technology selection. This should be fun, but it can also be daunting. So this is just the German-speaking digital health startup map from March of this year, right? So this is 3 countries, 1 small area. You can imagine what it's like globally. There's tons and tons of technology to choose from, and it is quite impossible to get on top of it all. But the first thing you want to ask is, are you doing something that's mass market, or are you doing something that's purpose built? And if you're doing something that's purpose built, are you using a vendor, or are you going to do it yourself? So keep those big questions in mind. And then there's a lot of actions that you need to take to test your technology and make sure that it's right for your trial. And I'm going to reflect back 1 slide, right? That's the reason you start so early. You never want to go into a trial like doubting the choice you've made about the technology. So make sure that there's room to test multiple devices or software options. If you are going to get something purpose built, begin your vendor selection early, and ask. You can't always ask peers. You don't always feel comfortable asking necessarily peers in your sector, but there are conferences like this. There are some resources that I've mentioned before from DIME, from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. There's lots of places to look about where you can get a catalog of things and understand what's available. But do begin your vendor selection early. Make sure you get a data sample. So you want to get your data and your database teams involved really, really early with your technology selection, and you want to make sure you get a data sample from whatever tool or technology you're using. Have your data team review it. You want them to ask questions. You want to renegotiate specifications if you can. Sometimes there are fields that require a calculation, and maybe you don't want the calculated data. Maybe you want all the raw numbers that were entered because it's important to you to understand all of the inputs. So make sure that you can see that if you want to. You want to make decisions about how you will deal with missing data. I think we're sort of all used to this in an electronic data capture setting where you can go back to the clinical research coordinators and ask your monitor to help you collect that data. But when you've got, say, a device that's in the wild at home, and let's say they're using a wrist wearable and they just took it off for a day, right? That data is missing. There's no real way to go back and recapture that. So you don't want to be surprised by that. You want to make sure you think about it and how it will be managed. And that flows into sort of your statistical analysis plan design and an understanding of your sample size. And something else that you want to know is sort of how and when you can view incoming data. Now, I know if you're doing a blinded study, you don't want to see things early in the process, but you do want someone on your side who can verify that the data is coming in, that it is the quality that you expect, and that it is complete. So that's another thing to get your data and your database teams involved in. You're going to need to make decisions pretty early about whether you're going to use custom questionnaires that you're building or designing. Is that part of your work? Or are you going to use existing scales? If you're going to use existing scales, you might need a license. And as I talk about a little bit later, you may also, if you're transferring them from a paper form to a digital form, you may need to have that approved by the scale provider. Depending on how you're doing this, you might want the data to talk to your electronic data capture, right? You might want it to talk to your patient database, and so you'll again need to get your database teams in there. Make sure that there is someone in your organization who's the expert on this, who knows how it all runs, so that they can train everyone down the line, and make sure, again, that there's time to test and troubleshoot. So technology provision is also another one that can have many paths off of it, and where do you start and how do you answer them? So you need to ask some questions. We're back to one of those first ones. Who needs these devices? The patients, the clinicians, the observers. Are you going to be providing the technology, or is it bring your own device? And if you are providing the technology, are you actually the ones sending it, or is your third vendor sending it? There's questions there about how it gets there safely to the person and privacy around addresses, et cetera. So you need to think about that. And then with BYOD, there are other elements of that can have a timeline impact when you think about how, if it is an app, for example, it might need to be approved in various app stores, et cetera. Does this technology increase accessibility and inclusion? As I mentioned, that's one of the things, one of the reasons you do decentralized clinical trials. So I'm encouraging everyone to make sure that that's an early question, so you don't wind up with data that can't be, translated really to other populations. And then who, again, is using it? Because if you have just patients using it, that's one type of training. If you have just clinicians using it, that's another type of training and another type of adoption pathway. So make sure you're clear about that. So what you can do about these is you research technology adoption in your target group. How many Android users in the population that you're going to? How many Apple users, if that's the case? How many people really are using wrist wearables? Is it only people in their 30s? Like, just do a little research on that. Think about the different needs of patients and clinicians. Ease of adoption, I've mentioned it several times, but it's for a patient who is eager and wants to know about this therapeutic, is really interested in understanding how this disease is a part of their life. They will often go to the ends of the earth, right? They'll take up that technology. They'll learn how to use it. They'll actually give you some of your best feedback. Clinicians who are seeing patients in the clinic are now seeing patients in this remote setting that might be a little bit new to them, already have several devices in their own work environment. Their ease of adoption might be much harder, actually, and so you have to plan for that. Data return is a key thing. Are you giving any data back to the patients? It's something to think about. It's a big ask to give someone a device and say, all right, for 6 months, can you tell me everything about yourself? And then you don't give them any data. You don't give them any metrics about how they're progressing. You don't even tell them they're doing a good job. So think about sort of what type of data you're returning. Same to the clinicians. what data they get back, where can they see it, how often, and how often do they need to check it in a study where they're not seeing the patients at the same cadence. And then finally, integration with other data. That's usually more critical for the clinicians, but it's definitely something to spend time on. If you are getting, say, activity readings from participants who have a wrist wearable or an accelerometer at home, can that data come straight into a chart that the clinician can review? So any of their laboratory data that may have come from the hospital is sitting in the same place with this other activity data from home. I highly encourage using consultants or patient engagement groups to give you user feedback. Don't just send a device to people and cross your fingers. There's a way to get a little bit of early feedback on whether or not folks will use it. Begin outreach to underrepresented groups early to make sure that you're using the right channels to find them and get them interested. Have users who may have disabilities assess the accessibility of it for you. You don't have to think of all of these things on your own. And always consider a web portal. Not everyone uses a smartphone anymore. There's also the Android versus Apple platform. You need folks who can design in both. And honestly, some things just display a little bit better on a bigger screen. And if that's something that you know is easily accessible to your population, a web portal can do a whole lot of work for you. So user support and what you have to show the ethics board, they're separate, but they kind of fall into this category of things that can slow you down a lot if you're not on top of it. So with the ethics board, you want to make sure that you know what you have to show them. This is particularly important if you plan to use an e-consent process that is completely away from the clinic, right? The ethics board often wants to see the screens. Sometimes they want a sort of environment in which they can walk through the flow, understand the signature process, and understand how to ask questions so that they can be certain that people are truly informed. You will also have to present your materials that support the users to the ethics board, just so that they can make sure that they are consistent and will be able to keep the user safe. But you want to think about what those are. If you were using a vendor, do they offer a support package, and is it robust enough? I think clinical trials sort of operate one space in people's minds. And then if you add some technology in there, most of us have been kind of accidentally trained on this very commercial sense of technology where there's some sort of 24/7 support, even if it's just being able to talk with a chatbot about why their watch isn't working, or maybe it's being able to find a user manual online. So you want to make sure that your support package is easy for participants to use, doesn't make them have to go way out of their way to get an answer, but is also consistent with safety and privacy in the clinical trials space. So that's definitely something to think about. And then we talked a little bit about how you will conduct your consent process and what the ethics board needs to see there. So a robust user manual is a must, and I'll show you a couple pages from one we've used. And given all the technology that's at our disposal right now, consider video or audio options. Sometimes these are easy, you can, and folks can go back and refer to them again and again. As I talked a little bit about, we've all been kind of trained on these consumer expectations of support around a consumer style device. If you give people a phone or a wrist wearable, don't forget translations. Again, I think this audience is well versed in those, but this comes all the way down to the app screens. If you have an app here, they may want to see the actual screens in all the languages. It's not just enough to see the translations. They want to see that it displays appropriately. As always, consider a web portal. You still have to show those screens to the ethics board. But again, they solve a lot of problems. There are built-in screen readers. It's larger. People can adjust the size, and sometimes it's just more accessible for people. And as I noted, the ethics board might want to see your screens. So just a couple of examples. We have a study that actually involves a mobile clinic and about 10 devices and several apps. So this is one of the ways that we sort of displayed some of the activity data for the participant, giving them the actual dates in the, the 2 months that they would be on, and little icons for exactly what they'd be using every day. So this satisfies sort of a visual kind of mind. This one wouldn't be so great for a screen reader, so you might have to think about, if this is a virtual manual, consider, making this all text instead. But, give yourself some options. Really think creatively about how you can get the clearest sort of support to your patient, because they like to feel successful. They like to feel like they are doing a good job in the study, and that they're getting you the data that you need and the data that they want. So the easier you can make it for them to participate, the better. And then this is just another page from the manual here. And one of the things I liked about this is it clearly depicts both the technology and the cord, the charging apparatus that it goes to. Some of the feedback we got even from our first participants was that there were a lot of cords. It was kind of hard to keep track. And, I think we probably all have, anyone who's using a lot of devices has this problem themselves on a smaller scale. So think about what you're doing if you're introducing a lot of technology for your participant, and just make it as easy as possible for them to check into it themselves and make sure they're doing the right thing. So finally, a couple of special considerations. So I think I've touched on a lot of these as we went through, but if you are doing BYOD, bring your own device software provision for your technological tools for your decentralized trial, it's going to have to go through an app store. It's going to have to go through two if you're using both Android and Apple devices. And if you've got a vendor, then just know that that's something that's impacting their timeline. If you were doing this build and design yourself, then know that that's going to impact your timeline, and just make sure that that's planned in there. And as always, do consider a web portal. We mostly build apps, but it always comes up in every single one of our initial design meetings to maybe a web portal just in case. Can also can serve as a way to draw people to the study if it's well designed. So it's never a bad thing to keep in mind. If you are provisioning technology, it's got to go out. Possibly you want it back. What are you doing with it when it comes back? Now you've got all these devices, some of which may have become obsolete in the course of a 2 or 3 year study, depending on who the provider is, right? So what are you going to do with those? And then lost or damaged devices. Something gets shipped and doesn't make it to the participant. What is your how are you filling that back in? Or do you replace damaged devices? These are things you need to know before you go out so you don't get surprised. What is your visibility into whether or not the devices are malfunctioning? So that's another thing to think about when you are working with your vendor or designing for yourself. Yes, you want to see that the data is coming in, but is there anything you can tell from the back end about if the device itself is malfunctioning or just isn't charged or something like that? Translations, again, just because everyone knows they can shift timelines. And then if you are working with license scales, as I discussed before, sometimes when you license them, if they're going from paper to digital, it is a requirement that they look a certain way. Sometimes that just means we want radio buttons instead of a slider. Sometimes that means it has to be in exactly these colors and exactly in portrait instead of landscape, et cetera, et cetera. So getting it built to spec and then getting it reviewed can add some time. So finally, I did mention that I wanted to share some resources here. And I'm sure there are also local resources in these categories, but I just wanted to sort of point this out so that you don't have to worry alone. There's lots of guidance and best practices out there for how to do these, sort of very straightforward, common sense things to prepare, but it can be daunting, right? Because there's so much information. So here are some ways to narrow how you do that. So Critical Path Institute has a couple of best practices around implementation of patient-reported outcome measures, whether or not they're already electronic, whether or not you need to convert them. And they also have one for thinking about participant registration in bring your own device technology or studies, which can be different than obviously if you have a clinic. The Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative has some great ideas and resources, and I'm particularly fond of the selecting a digital health technology and testing a digital health technology. If you're new to this and don't have protocols in place already, this is a good place to start for shaping things. And then if you just are curious about what's out there, one of DIME's greatest resources actually is their library of digital endpoints, which is crowdsourced. So both you get to go in and see what other people have found and tried and worked with and get their feedback on it, and you can contribute. And then it just grows as a community resource over time. So I recommend all of those as a way to get started, particularly if this feels new or daunting to you. But technology can be a great asset in decentralized clinical trials, and I think you'll get better and better at using it every time. So thank you for your time, and I welcome all your questions.
Thank you very much. So, no, very informative talk. Thank you. Do we have any questions from the chat or discussion boxes, or anyone want to ask a question directly now?
Oh, wow. There's a couple. Okay. So I see I fully agree to the content of your presentation, but I'm wondering your thoughts on bringing DCTs to Europe. The US are much more open to innovation, whereas in Europe, many regulators are rather hesitant. What do you think is missing in Europe? That's a great question. So we have a group in Eastern Europe, in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and that's actually where most of our engineers are. And so we've had a little success doing things locally there, largely because that crew they have worked with the ethics boards there. They sort of know what's going on, but it has been slower. I think that it's just going to take probably more country by country kind of work, right? Like once one group gets it right, the next group might be able to do it a little bit faster. And a lot of it hinges around the privacy, right? Every time we got stopped by an ethics board, it was the GDPR, making sure our servers were in Europe, making sure no one in the US could access that, and that we could sort of completely eliminate the history of anyone, the privacy, or guarantee the privacy there. So, like everything, it's just going to take a little bit longer. But like I said, I think you might have to do local studies first, and then you'd have to go broader. I see another one here. When sharing data with participant, how do you maintain possible impact on blinding participant? And share with, okay. Oh, okay. That's actually a very interesting one. So I think the first thing that I would say is that you don't always have to share values with a patient, right? If you were returning data to them, it's more just about getting feedback to them that they have completed the task. Like that's kind of the bare minimum, right? So if you have someone who is getting, let's say they've maybe got a biological sort of device on and they're getting sort of blood readings every day or something like that, and you don't want them to share that with the clinician. Instead, you could simply report back to them that readings were taken successfully yesterday, and that's 10% of your readings in the trial. Or you could give them a range, or you could say, we're pleased that these have been in the normal range or something. So you don't have to give them data that could then impact, like accidentally if they communicate it in this study. That is a really thoughtful question. And sometimes it's less about returning data to them than having enough information so that they know it's day 3 of 10, so that they feel proud of the work that they've done, kind of thing. So don't give them more than they could handle is what I would say there.